In some of the driest landscapes on Earth, survival depended on knowing secrets hidden inside the desert itself. Long before modern Wells bottles or irrigation systems, ancient people learned how certain cactus plants could provide moisture-food medicine and vital resources when water became dangerously scarce. This knowledge could mean the difference between life and death beneath a relentless sun. If you enjoyed discovering the forgotten survival skills of the ancient world like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we explore how ancient people used cactus to survive without water. By late afternoon, the desert has already stripped the landscape down to essentials. Stone dust thorn distance and heat remain. The air trembles above the ground. Dry washes cut through the earth like old scars, empty for months at a time, while low mountains rise in the distance with no promise of shade. A traveller moving through this country without knowledge can be surrounded by life and still feel as though nothing here can keep a human being alive. There may be no river in sight, no pond, no green meadow, and no obvious spring. Yet people have crossed, hunted, gathered, settled, traded, and raised families in these dry lands for thousands of years. Their survival does not depend on finding an endless supply of water. It depends on knowing where water hides when it appears, what signs reveal it, and which living things hold enough moisture to matter. Across the deserts and semi-arid regions of what is now Mexico, and the southwestern United States, rainfall is often unreliable and fiercely seasonal. Some places receive summer storms that arrive suddenly, darkening the sky and sending torrents through channels that were bone dry only hours before. Elsewhere, winter rains bring slower relief. Long intervals can separate these events, and even within the same valley, one slope may receive rain while another remains almost untouched. Ancient communities living in these environments cannot treat water as something guaranteed by the landscape. Every journey, harvest, hunt, and settlement choice is shaped by its availability. Springs become landmarks of enormous importance. Rock shelters near dependable seeps attract repeated use. Natural basins that collect stormwater can become temporary reservoirs. Knowledge of distant water sources becomes as valuable as knowledge of trails. The danger is not only thirst in the dramatic sense. Dehydration begins quietly. Heat increases the body's need for water, even while the dry air makes sweat disappear almost as soon as it reaches the skin. A person may continue walking while losing moisture faster than expected. Food becomes part of the calculation because digestion itself requires water, and salty or very dry foods can make thirst worse. The desert therefore rewards a broader kind of intelligence. Survival is not simply about drinking whenever water is found. It is about managing effort, traveling at cooler times, resting in shade, carrying what can be carried, and choosing foods that contribute moisture rather than consuming it. This is where plants become part of the human water map. Desert vegetation may appear sparse, but it is not random. Mesquite follows certain soils and drainage patterns. Agave stores resources in thick leaves. Yucca offers fibers and edible parts under the right conditions. Cacti rise from rocky slopes, plains, and valleys in forms ranging from low pads to towering columns. To people unfamiliar with the desert, these plants can look like emergency containers filled with drinkable water. That image has become one of the most persistent myths of desert survival. Ancient people knew something more complicated. A cactus is not a wooden barrel with spines. Some contain useful moisture in edible tissues or fruit. Others contain bitter, irritating, or otherwise undesirable compounds. Knowing the difference can matter far more than simply knowing that a cactus stores water. Before that knowledge can be useful, people have to understand the landscape as a living calendar. Cactus that provides almost nothing in one month may become heavy with fruit in another. A dry valley may suddenly offer abundant food after seasonal rains. Blossoms appear, insects gather, birds change their movements, and fruit ripens in a sequence that experienced harvesters can anticipate. For ancient desert communities, these changes are information. The timing of a harvest can determine whether families gain only a brief meal or enough food to process and store for later. Missing the correct window can mean watching a major resource disappear into the mouths of birds, rodents, insects, and other competitors. Archaeology can show that humans have occupied many of these dry regions for very long periods, but the details of daily survival are harder to recover. Water leaves little trace when it is consumed. A temporary gathering camp beside a seasonal pool may leave only scattered stone tools, burned plant remains, or fragments of food waste. Organic containers decay. Footpaths vanish. The knowledge carried in memory leaves no direct fossil. What survives in the records suggests that people repeatedly returned to productive zones, followed seasonal resources, and gradually developed increasingly detailed relationships with desert plants. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earliest periods when populations were mobile and possessions were light. That incompleteness matters because modern observers often imagine ancient desert life as a continuous emergency. It was certainly dangerous and drought could become severe, but people who knew these environments were not wandering blindly from one desperate drink to another. They built mental maps composed of springs, shaded canyons, edible plants, game routes, rainfall patterns, mountain silhouettes, and seasonal harvests. Children grew up learning which places could be trusted and which could not. Elders carried memories of unusual dry years. Travelers adjusted routes according to conditions. A landscape that appears empty can contain an astonishing density of remembered detail for those who live within it. Cactus enters this world not as a miracle, but as one piece of a larger system. Its value grows from predictability. Many species survive where softer plants fail. Their fruits can arrive during seasons when other foods are limited. Their tissues hold moisture because the plants themselves are adapted to scarcity. This does not mean cactus replaces wells, spring streams, stored rainwater, or carried water. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient people endured prolonged drought, because survival depended on overlapping strategies rather than one secret resource. But cactus offered something important, a living reserve scattered across terrain that often looked unforgiving. That distinction changes the story. The real achievement is not that ancient people discovered they could cut open a plant and drink from it. The deeper achievement is that generations learned to recognize which plants were useful when they were useful, how to harvest them safely, how far they could be relied upon, and how they fit into a larger cycle of movement and memory. In a world where a missed spring or failed rain could carry serious consequences, knowledge became a form of stored water. And among the plants that embodied that knowledge most visibly, none was more striking than the cactus built by evolution to endure the very scarcity humans were trying to survive. The cactus survives because almost every part of its body has been redesigned around a single problem, losing as little water as possible, while capturing every brief opportunity to replace it. In wetter landscapes, plants can afford leaves. Leaves provide broad surfaces for sunlight and efficient gas exchange, but they also expose enormous areas through which water escapes. In a desert, that bargain becomes dangerous. Many cacti solve the problem by reducing their leaves, almost completely transforming them over evolutionary time into spines, while moving photosynthesis into thick green stems. What appears at first to be a strange swollen trunk is actually a highly specialized organ doing several jobs at once. It gathers sunlight, stores water, protects the plant, and supports a metabolism tuned to a world where rainfall may be brief and separated by long periods of drought. Inside that stem is not a hollow reservoir. The popular image of slicing into a cactus and finding clear liquid is misleading. Much of the stored moisture is locked inside soft mucilaginous tissues composed of living cells. These tissues can swell dramatically after rainfall, allowing the plant to increase its internal water supply without bursting. Columnar cacti such as saguaros can expand along accordion-like ribs as they absorb moisture. During dry periods, those same ribs contract. The cactus changes shape almost imperceptibly as months pass, carrying water from one season toward the next. To an experienced observer, the condition of the plant can reveal something about the recent history of rainfall. The outer skin is equally important. A waxy coating reduces evaporation, while the stem surface often has fewer exposed openings than the leaves of ordinary plants. Yet the cactus still needs carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. That creates an apparent contradiction. Opening pores during the scorching daytime would allow precious moisture to escape. Many cacti resolve this through a system known as crassulacean acid metabolism, usually shortened to CAM. Their stomata open primarily at night when temperatures are lower and humidity may be slightly higher. Carbon dioxide is taken in and temporarily stored in chemical form. During daylight, the stomata can remain largely closed while the stored carbon is used for photosynthesis. It is an elegant physiological compromise, allowing the plant to continue producing energy while sharply reducing water loss. Ancient people did not need biochemical terminology to recognize the practical result. A cactus remains firm when grasses have browned, and many shallow-rooted plants have disappeared. Its tissues stay moist through periods that would leave ordinary vegetation brittle. The plant becomes a visible sign of endurance, but that endurance is carefully defended. Spines deter animals shade the surface, and in some species can influence air movement close to the stem. Dense networks of spines may even help moderate intense sunlight. What looks like a simple weapon is part of a much more complicated survival system. Below ground, another adaptation works with equal speed. Many cacti possess surprisingly shallow root systems spreading outward near the soil surface, rather than plunging deeply downward. This allows them to capture rainfall almost immediately. Desert rain often arrives in short bursts. Water striking baked ground may evaporate quickly, or rush away through channels before penetrating very far. A broad network of roots near the surface can absorb moisture during that narrow window. Some roots grow rapidly when water becomes available, and become less active again during prolonged dryness. The plant is therefore not simply a passive container waiting to be filled. It is a system built to respond quickly to events that may last only a few hours. These adaptations help explain why cacti can become so abundant in places that appear nearly impossible for large, moisture-filled plants. But abundance does not automatically make them safe or useful to humans. Different species store different compounds, and even within a species the edible parts may be limited to fruit young pads, seeds, or carefully prepared tissues. Some cactus flesh is intensely bitter. Some contains chemicals that can cause nausea or other unpleasant effects. Some tissues are so fibrous or mucilaginous that consuming them provides far less usable moisture than an inexperienced traveler might expect. Ancient survival knowledge therefore rests on identification and preparation rather than desperation. The fruits are often a different matter. Many cactus species produce fleshy fruits deliberately designed to attract animals that will disperse their seeds. These fruits can contain significant moisture and energy at the same time. Birds, mammals, reptiles, insects, and humans all compete for them. When they ripen, a landscape that seemed austere can briefly become generous. Bright red, purple, orange, or yellow fruits appear against green stems and pale soil. For people who know when the harvest is coming, this is not merely a lucky discovery. It is a predictable seasonal event that can be built into movement, diet, and storage. There is another subtle advantage. A plant that stores water also buffers itself against short-term weather fluctuations. A shallow pool may vanish after a few days of heat, but a healthy cactus can retain moisture far longer. That does not make it a substitute for a spring, but it does make cactus-derived foods unusually valuable during dry conditions. Eating moisture-rich fruits or pads can reduce the amount of carried water needed for certain activities. This is a very different form of survival from drinking directly from a plant. Instead of replacing water, cactus becomes part of the water budget of the human body. Scholars still debate how early different cactus species began to be managed or deliberately encouraged by human communities, especially because the archaeological traces of plant use are often fragile. Seeds survive better than soft tissues. Charred remains may preserve only part of the story. Later indigenous traditions offer important clues, but they cannot simply be projected unchanged thousands of years into the past. Even so, the long relationship between people and cactus is difficult to miss. Where these plants are abundant, humans repeatedly learn to harvest, process, move, and sometimes cultivate them. The most important lesson is that the cactus does not defeat drought by containing an endless supply of water. It defeats drought by controlling lost timing exchange, expanding when rain comes, shrinking when it does not, and protecting every reserve it has accumulated. Human communities living beside it face the same environmental problem on a different scale. They too must conserve, anticipate, store, move carefully, and exploit brief moments of abundance. Long before anyone understands the chemistry inside the plant, the cactus already stands as a working demonstration of how survival in dry country actually operates, not through excess, but through extraordinary efficiency. Long before cactus becomes a symbol on flags, a crop in orchards, or a familiar image of the desert, it is first encountered as part of a difficult landscape filled with possibilities that are not immediately obvious. The earliest people moving through the dry regions of Mexico and the American Southwest do not arrive with a complete catalogue of safe plants. They learn through observation, repetition, inherited experience, and inevitably mistakes. A fruit eaten by birds may prove edible. A pad consumed by deer may still require preparation before a human stomach can tolerate it. A plant that looks promising may be useless, bitter, irritating, or dangerous, in a landscape where resources are scattered and seasonal. The difference between recognition and ignorance can shape whether a group moves comfortably through a dry year or enters it already weakened. This knowledge develops gradually, not as a single discovery, but as an accumulation of thousands of small decisions. People notice when certain cactus fruits ripen. They learn which slopes produce them most reliably, which valleys hold dense stands, and how the timing changes after winter rains or summer storms. They discover that some plants offer far more than others. The pads of prickly pear can provide food and moisture when collected and prepared correctly. Their fruits are sweet, full of seeds, and often abundant enough to gather in quantity. Other cacti produce smaller fruits that are still useful in particular seasons. Large columnar species in the Sonoran region offer harvests that arrive high above the ground, demanding specialized tools and careful timing. None of this knowledge is simple. It is ecological memory made practical. The first challenge is often physical access. Cacti protect themselves aggressively. Spines can lodge in skin-clothing animal hides or the mouth. Some species have large, obvious thorns that are easy to avoid if approached carefully. Others carry clusters of tiny barbed glochids, that are far more troublesome. These minute spines can become embedded almost invisibly and cause prolonged irritation. Anyone who handles prickly pear casually learns quickly that the fruit may look inviting while the plant itself insists on caution. Ancient harvesters developed methods to reduce this danger. Tools extend reach. Sticks, tongs, baskets, scraping surfaces, heat, or abrasion can help remove spines before the plant is eaten or processed. The surprising part is how much of the cactus can become useful once this knowledge exists. Fruits are the most obvious resource because they combine moisture with sugar and can often be eaten fresh after careful cleaning. Seeds add another layer of nutrition. Pads from certain prickly pear species can be consumed when young and tender, though preparation matters. In some regions, cactus material is dried or cooked to improve storage and digestibility. The plant is not merely emergency food gathered during starvation. It can become a predictable part of a seasonal diet, especially when combined with mesquite pods, agave seeds, game, and cultivated foods in later periods. Archaeological evidence for these early uses is uneven. Soft cactus tissue rarely survives for thousands of years unless conditions are unusually favorable. Seeds' pollen, coprolites, fibers, and residues can provide clues, while dry caves and rock shelters sometimes preserve plant material that would disappear elsewhere. What survives in the record suggests long-term use of desert plants, but scholars still debate the exact chronology and intensity of cactus exploitation in many places. The absence of abundant remains does not necessarily mean the plant was unimportant. A fruit eaten fresh can leave almost nothing behind, particularly if seeds are scattered away from a camp or pass through the digestive system. Ethnographic records from later indigenous communities provide another window, though they must be used carefully. Practices recorded in the historic period may preserve older traditions, but cultures change, technologies evolve, and environmental conditions shift. Researchers cannot simply assume that every technique documented centuries ago existed unchanged in deep prehistory. Even so, the broad pattern is convincing. Communities across cactus-rich environments develop detailed systems for identifying useful species, harvesting them at the right moment, removing spines, preparing edible tissues, and incorporating them into wider food strategies. In central and northern Mexico, prickly pear becomes particularly important. The fruits, often known as tunas in Spanish-speaking regions today, can appear in enormous quantities under favorable conditions. Their sweetness makes them immediately attractive, but their deeper value lies in abundance and moisture. A person eating several ripe fruits is not simply consuming calories. The body also receives water locked naturally into the flesh. In dry country, this matters. A meal that helps satisfy hunger, while contributing moisture, reduces pressure on carried water supplies, especially during harvesting trips or travel between more dependable sources. Yet ancient people do not confuse moisture-rich food with true drinking water. That distinction is essential. Cactus consumption can support hydration, but a human body working in severe heat still requires substantial water. A person who believes cactus can replace wells and springs completely is operating under a dangerous misunderstanding. The real strength of cactus lies in supplementing a broader survival system. It buys flexibility. It can reduce water demand at certain times, extend food supplies, and support movement through landscapes where every container of carried water has weight. This is also where plant knowledge becomes social knowledge. One person learning that a fruit is edible is useful. A community transmitting the season, location, preparation method, and risks associated with that fruit is far more powerful. Knowledge can be taught to children embedded in seasonal routines, connected to ceremonies, and carried across generations. Routes become linked to harvest zones. Camps appear where different resources overlap. Families may know not just that cactus is useful, but which stand fruits earlier, which place was damaged by drought, and which plants should be left untouched to ensure later growth. Some cactus species may eventually be encouraged near settlements or favored in particular locations. This is not necessarily formal agriculture in the earlier stages. Human management can begin with much smaller actions, protecting useful plants, removing competing vegetation, dispersing seeds near camps, transplanting desirable forms, or repeatedly harvesting in ways that alter local abundance. Over long periods, these quiet choices can change both plants and landscapes. What begins as opportunistic gathering therefore becomes something much more refined. Cactus is transformed by knowledge from a thorn-covered obstacle into a seasonal resource with many roles. It offers fruit, moisture, seeds, edible tissues, fibers, and later even materials for tools, dyes, boundaries, and ritual life. But before any of those later uses can develop, people first have to solve the most basic problem, learning which plants help, which do not, and how to approach them without turning a valuable food source into another desert hazard. The image is almost irresistible. A traveler staggers across an empty desert, finds a barrel-shaped cactus, cuts it open, and discovers enough water inside to survive. The scene has appeared so often in popular stories that it feels like common knowledge. Yet this is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings surrounding desert plants. Cacti do store large quantities of water, but the water is held inside living tissue mixed with plant acids, sugars, salts, mucilage, and other chemical compounds. In many species, the flesh is unpleasantly bitter. In some, consuming large amounts can cause nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, exactly the kind of reaction a dehydrated person cannot afford. Ancient people who depended on cactus understood something that modern survival myths often erase: the fact that a plant contains water does not mean that water can simply be drunk. That distinction begins with the structure of cactus tissue itself. When the stem is cut, it generally does not release a pool of clear liquid. Instead, the interior is fibrous, wet, and often gelatinous. Moisture is distributed throughout the cells, designed to support the plant through drought, rather than to exist as a free reservoir. Extracting significant liquid can require crushing or processing, and the result may still be chemically unsuitable for drinking. Some cactus tissues contain oxalic acid and other compounds that can irritate the digestive system or place additional stress on the body when consumed in excess. Species vary greatly, which makes generalized advice particularly dangerous. One cactus cannot be treated as interchangeable with another simply because both appear swollen with moisture. There are limited exceptions that help explain how the myth may have grown. Certain cactus fruits are safe and rich in water. Young pads of edible prickly pear species contain considerable moisture and can contribute meaningfully to hydration when eaten as food. Some indigenous traditions also include carefully prepared cactus tissues for specific purposes, but none of this supports the idea that an unfamiliar cactus should be hacked open in an emergency and treated like a canteen. The useful parts, species timing and preparation, are what matter. Without those layers of knowledge, the same plant that appears to offer rescue can make a difficult situation worse. The barrel cactus is especially tangled in this mythology. Its rounded form makes it look almost deliberately designed to hold water for thirsty travelers. In reality, most barrel cacti do not provide a safe source of drinkable fluid. Their pulp may contain moisture, but also compounds that can produce gastrointestinal distress. A person already losing water through heat and sweat gains little if the attempt to hydrate leads to vomiting or diarrhea. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how widely different cactus tissues were used in emergency circumstances in antiquity, and practices varied from place to place. But there is no archaeological reason to imagine ancient desert peoples relying routinely on raw barrel cactus pulp as a substitute for dependable water sources. Instead, their survival systems are built around knowledge of real water. Springs seep shallow groundwater. Seasonal streams, rock basins, and stored rain are fundamentally more important. A skilled traveler does not wait until thirst becomes desperate and then search for a random plant. Routes are planned around known sources. Movement may begin before dawn or continue into cooler evening hours. Midday heat is avoided when possible. Water is carried in containers suited to the culture and period, including gourds, pottery baskets, made watertight with coatings, or animal skin vessels in some regions. Cactus foods reduce pressure on those supplies, but they do not erase the need for them. This is an important correction because romantic survival stories tend to focus on dramatic last-minute rescue. Ancient desert survival is usually less theatrical and more intelligent. It is about preventing desperation rather than solving it after it arrives. A community that knows where a spring lies beyond the next ridge where saguaro fruit will ripen in early summer, or which rock hollow still holds stormwater, is far safer than someone who possesses a knife and vague confidence about cactus. The most valuable resource is often information carried in memory. Even the moisture in edible cactus has to be understood in context. Prickly pear fruit, for example, can be refreshing and water-rich, but it also contains sugars, fiber, and numerous hard seeds. The fruit is food first, not purified water. Pads can provide moisture as well, especially when tender, but they are commonly cleaned and cooked rather than treated as a raw emergency drink. Their slippery texture comes partly from mucilage, a group of substances that help the plant hold water. That same texture can make cactus seem more liquid than it really is. The body still has to process the plant material before gaining the moisture inside. There is another problem hidden inside the survival myth: harvesting cactus costs energy. Cutting into a heavily spined plant in extreme heat takes time and effort. Removing spines can be difficult. Injuries to the hands can become serious when people still need to walk, climb, carry loads, or prepare food. Destroying a mature cactus for uncertain moisture may also sacrifice a valuable resource that could have produced fruit for many seasons. For communities living permanently in dry environments, such waste would make little sense when better strategies are available. Ancient harvesting practices therefore tend to be selective. Fruit can be gathered without killing the plant. Young pads can be removed while the rest continues growing. Seeds can be dispersed naturally or intentionally. Productive stands can be revisited year after year. This approach turns cactus from a desperate one-time resource into something far more valuable, a renewable part of the landscape. The difference reflects a broader contrast between temporary survival and long-term residence. Someone lost in a desert thinks about getting through the next day. A community that expects its grandchildren to live there thinks about next season and the season after that. Popular culture often compresses all of this knowledge into one false lesson: cactus equals water. The older lesson is more precise. Some cactus species provide moisture-rich foods. Some provide fruits that can significantly support hydration. Some may offer tissues that are usable after careful preparation. Others are poor choices or actively unpleasant. Scholars still debate the details of particular prehistoric practices, especially where plant remains do not preserve well, but the basic pattern is clear. Desert peoples survive through identification, timing, restraint, and accumulated ecological knowledge, rather than by treating every succulent plant as an emergency reservoir. And once that myth is removed, the cactus becomes more interesting, not less. Its true value lies in the specific ways people learn to use it without misunderstanding what it is. Among all the species scattered across the drylands, one group becomes especially important because it offers both dependable food and substantial moisture without requiring the destruction of the plant itself. Its flat pads spread across the ground in tangled clusters, and when the season is right, they carry bright fruits that can transform a harsh landscape into a temporary harvest field. This is the prickly pear, and for countless desert communities it becomes far more useful than any imaginary cactus filled with drinking water. Prickly pear does not look like a plant designed for abundance. Its flattened pads rise from dry soil in overlapping layers, each one armed with spines and often covered with nearly invisible glochids that punish careless hands. Yet when the fruiting season arrives, those same plants can become some of the richest patches of food in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Red, purple, orange, or yellow fruits gather along the edges of the pads, sometimes in such numbers that a single stand can support repeated harvesting. For ancient communities living across Mexico and the American Southwest, this matters because prickly pear offers two things at once: energy and moisture. It is not a substitute for a spring, but during dry periods it can reduce the strain on stored and carried water while adding badly needed food. The genus Opuntia includes many species, and not all are equally useful in the same way. Some grow low and dense across rocky ground. Others form larger shrubs or tree-like shapes. Their fruits vary in size, sweetness, color, seed content, and season. The pads also differ in thickness, fiber, and palatability. Ancient people living among these plants do not think of prickly pear as one uniform resource. They learn particular stands, particular species, and particular times of year. One slope may produce better fruit than another. One patch may ripen earlier because it receives more sun. Another may survive drought more reliably because runoff collects nearby. This level of detail turns a broad plant category into a map of dependable opportunities. The fruit is especially valuable because much of its mass is water. Eating ripe prickly pear does not deliver pure liquid, but it gives the body moisture while also supplying natural sugars and other nutrients. In the heat, that combination can be important. A person walking long distances through dry country still needs drinking water, but moisture-rich food means that every meal does not increase thirst. During harvesting trips, people can consume some of the fruit directly while carrying additional quantities back to camp. The fruit becomes part of the hydration strategy precisely because it is food and water-bearing tissue at the same time. Getting to it safely, however, requires technique. The large spines are obvious. The smaller glochids are not. These tiny barbed hairs detach easily and can lodge in skin, lips, tongues, or clothing. A careless harvest can leave hands burning long after the meal is finished. Indigenous communities develop practical methods for dealing with them. Fruits can be twisted or knocked from the plant using sticks, tongs, or other tools that keep the hands away from the surface. They can then be brushed, rolled, rubbed, or passed carefully near flame to remove the finer spines. The precise techniques vary by region and tradition, and the archaeological evidence rarely preserves the full sequence, but later documented practices show just how much specialized knowledge can surround what looks like a simple fruit harvest. Young pads offer another resource. When collected at the right stage before they become too fibrous and tough, they contain substantial moisture and can be prepared as food. Removing the spines and glochids is essential, and cooking improves texture and digestibility. Their usefulness lies less in emergency consumption than in regular seasonal eating. Fresh plant tissue can supplement diets dominated at other times by dry seeds, stored grains, roasted agave, or meat. This is important because desert diets are not merely about finding enough calories. They are also about balancing foods that demand water with foods that help supply it. Prickly pear has another advantage that is easy to overlook. It can be extraordinarily productive without requiring deep, constantly wet soil. The same adaptations that keep the plant alive during drought allow it to hold resources until conditions improve. After sufficient rain, flowering and fruit production can transform stands that seemed nearly dormant. This gives human communities a form of resilience. A failed grass seed harvest or poor hunt does not automatically mean every other resource has failed as well. Different plants respond differently to rainfall, temperature and season. Survival improves when people rely on a portfolio of resources rather than one crop or one water source. That does not mean cactus harvests are guaranteed. Severe drought can reduce flowering and fruiting. Frost can damage some stands. Insects, rodents, birds, and larger animals compete for fruit. Local abundance can change from year to year. Scholars still debate how much prehistoric communities deliberately manage certain prickly pear populations, especially in periods before clear evidence of cultivation appears. What survives in the records suggests repeated exploitation, and in some regions increasingly close human relationships with useful cactus varieties. Yet it is difficult to determine where intensive gathering ends and deliberate management begins. The seeds provide a further clue to the depth of use. Prickly pear fruits contain many hard seeds that can survive in archaeological context better than the soft fruit around them. They sometimes appear in coprolites and occupation deposits, offering direct evidence that people were eating cactus fruit. But even these traces reveal only part of the story. Seeds cannot always show whether fruit was eaten fresh, mashed, dried, cooked, or processed into another food. They also cannot reveal the full social organization of harvests, who gathered, who processed, how far people traveled, or whether certain productive stands were associated with particular families or communities. Seasonality gives the harvest social importance. When fruit becomes abundant, gathering can involve more than individual snacking. Large quantities can be collected quickly before animals heat or over-ripening take their share. Processing allows abundance to be extended beyond the brief period of ripeness. Pulp can be crushed, strained, boiled, dried, or concentrated depending on local traditions and available technology. The result can become a food reserve that lasts far longer than fresh fruit would. At that point, cactus is no longer simply something found in the desert. It becomes something incorporated into planning. For people moving between known springs or camps, productive prickly pear stands can also shape routes. A journey that passes through fruiting cactus offers food and moisture along the way. In years when water sources are low, these patches gain even greater value. A traveller who understands the landscape may deliberately time movement to coincide with ripening fruit, reducing the load that must be carried. This is not survival without water in the literal sense. It is survival with less dependence on immediately available drinking water, because the landscape itself contributes moisture through food. And this is the deeper reason prickly pear becomes so important. It does not perform a miracle. It simply combines several modest advantages that become powerful when layered together. It survives drought, regrows, after harvesting produces edible fruits, offers usable pads, stores moisture, and can occur in dense, predictable stands. For ancient people who understand exactly when and how to use it, those advantages turn a thorn-covered plant into one of the desert's most dependable allies. A cactus harvest begins long before the first fruit is cut. People who depend on these plants learn that the difference between abundance and injury lies in preparation. The desert does not reward haste. A productive patch may appear generous from a distance, heavy with fruit or fresh pads, but approaching it carelessly can mean torn skin, embedded spines, damaged tools, wasted food, and a plant injured so badly that future harvests decline. Ancient desert communities therefore develop ways of gathering that are selective, efficient, and surprisingly conservative. The goal is not to strip the plant. It is to take what is useful while leaving enough intact for the cactus to survive flower again and remain part of the landscape year after year. This matters because mature cacti can represent decades of accumulated growth. Some species expand slowly, especially where rainfall is uncertain. Destroying an established plant for a single meal would sacrifice a resource that might otherwise produce fruit for many seasons. Ancient harvesters do not need written conservation rules to understand this. Repeated use teaches the consequences. A patch damaged too heavily one year may provide less the next. A plant cut badly can rot or become vulnerable to insects. A productive stand protected from unnecessary harm by contrast becomes something closer to a living pantry. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how early such management practices began, but long-term indigenous traditions across cactus-rich regions show that careful harvesting can be part of a broader ethic of using without exhausting. The tools themselves are often simple. Long sticks allow fruit to be knocked or twisted free without forcing the harvester into the densest spines. Forked branches can hold or turn pads. Tongs fashioned from wood or other materials extend the hands. Baskets receive fruit without requiring repeated contact. In some areas, harvesting tools become specialized enough to reflect generations of refinement. Their design depends on the cactus being gathered. A low prickly pear patch presents a different problem from a tall columnar cactus, whose fruits ripen several meters above the ground. Yet the principle remains the same: distance from the spines reduces injury and makes gathering faster. Once collected, the food still has to be made safe. This is where a second layer of skill appears. Large spines can be cut or scraped away. Tiny glochids require more care because they are easy to miss. Fruits may be brushed with plant fibers rolled over rough surfaces or exposed briefly to flame to burn away the finest irritating hairs. The method depends on available materials and local custom. Pads require similar treatment, and the younger tissues are often preferred because they are softer and less fibrous. Ancient people are not simply finding edible plants. They are transforming dangerous surfaces into usable food through repeated practiced motions. Water conservation continues throughout this process. In extremely dry settings, washing every fruit with precious drinking water would be wasteful. Dry cleaning, scraping, fire, and abrasion accomplish much of the same work without consuming stored supplies. This is a subtle but important part of desert adaptation. Water-saving knowledge extends far beyond the act of drinking. It influences food preparation, cooking, movement, hygiene, storage, and the choice of tools. A technique that saves only a small amount each day can become significant across weeks of drought. Heat also changes when harvesting occurs. Midday may offer the brightest light, but it is often the worst time for hard work. Early morning and late afternoon reduce heat stress and water loss from the human body. Fruit gathered in the cooler hours may also remain in better condition during transport. People accustomed to the desert organize labor around these rhythms. They do not fight the climate continuously. They work with it, adjusting effort to temperature and shade. This can make the difference between a harvest that conserves water and one that consumes more through sweat than the food ultimately provides. The fruits themselves are highly perishable once fully ripe. This creates urgency without encouraging recklessness. A patch may become ready within a narrow seasonal window, and waiting too long means losing the crop to animals' fermentation, insects, or decay. Families or larger groups can therefore gather quickly when conditions are right, carrying the harvest back to processing areas. Some fruit is eaten fresh, providing immediate moisture. The rest can be converted into forms that survive longer than the soft pulp itself. Drying is one solution, though. Drying removes much of the moisture that made fresh cactus useful in the first place. The advantage is storage. A concentrated food can be carried through later periods when fresh fruit is gone. Boiling or reducing pulp offers another possibility, producing thicker pastes or syrups that contain energy in a smaller volume. Seeds can remain part of the mixture or be separated depending on tradition. In some regions, fermentation develops from sugary cactus juices, creating beverages with social or ceremonial roles, as well as nutritional value. The exact antiquity of specific preparation methods is not always clear, and scholars still debate how far historic practices can be projected into earlier periods. But the underlying logic is, ancient short-lived abundance must be converted into something that can survive scarcity. Even the waste from processing can have uses. Seeds discarded near camps may germinate under favorable conditions. Peels and pulp remnants can feed animals or return nutrients to the soil. Spines may be repurposed as small tools or needles in some contexts, while fibrous plant tissues can serve other practical functions. This does not mean every part is always used, but desert economies often encourage close attention to materials because transporting resources across dry landscapes is costly. Selective harvesting can also alter the cactus population over generations. If people repeatedly favor plants with larger, sweeter, less spiny, or more easily harvested fruits, they may unintentionally increase the spread of those traits by dispersing seeds near settlements or travel routes. Later deliberate cultivation strengthens this effect. Human choice begins to shape the plant even before formal agriculture becomes obvious in the archaeological record. What looks like wild desert vegetation may therefore contain traces of very old human preference. Perhaps the most surprising detail is that restraint can be more important than extraction. A traveller in distress thinks about what can be taken immediately. A community living in the same place for centuries must think differently. It learns which pads can be removed without harming future growth, which fruits should be left for seed, which stands need recovery, and which plants should remain untouched, because they mark dependable roots or productive ground. No single explanation fully accounts for the development of these practices, and direct archaeological proof is difficult, but the pattern fits a larger truth of long-term desert life. Survival depends less on consuming everything available than on preserving the systems that make future survival possible. The cactus harvest, then, is not merely an act of gathering food. It is a negotiation with scarcity. Every spine avoided, every fruit cleaned without wasting water, every pad cut without killing the plant, and every surplus portion preserved for later reflects the same underlying principle. In a dry land, abundance is temporary. Skill lies in making it last. In the Sonoran Desert, one of the most dramatic cactus harvests begins high above the ground. By early summer, when the heat becomes severe and many smaller plants have already dried into pale stalks, the giant saguaro begins to ripen its fruit. The timing is almost paradoxical. This is one of the harshest moments of the year, when daytime temperatures can become dangerous and surface water may be scarce, yet the desert suddenly produces a crop rich in moisture and sugar. The fruit split open near the tops of tall columns, and branching arms revealing bright red interiors crowded with tiny black seeds. Birds arrive first, bats, insects, and other animals follow. For indigenous peoples of the Sonoran region, especially communities whose traditions are deeply tied to the saguaro, This brief season becomes one of the most important points in the annual cycle. The height of the fruit creates an obvious problem. Mature saguaros can tower far beyond a person's reach, and climbing them would be dangerous as well as damaging to the plant. Harvesters therefore use long poles traditionally constructed by joining together the dried ribs of dead saguaros. These light but strong tools can reach fruit clusters several meters above the ground. A forked or shaped end helps dislodge ripe fruits, which fall onto the desert floor to be gathered below. The method is ingenious partly because it uses material supplied by the same species without cutting living plants. Even in death, the structural ribs of the saguaro continue to contribute to the harvest. The fruit itself is extraordinarily useful. Fresh saguaro fruit contains water as well as carbohydrates, making it especially valuable at a time when both heat and dryness place heavy demands on the human body. The pulp can be eaten directly, but much of the harvest is processed. It may be crushed, strained, boiled down, or dried into forms that can be stored. Concentrated syrup allows a short seasonal abundance to be carried forward into later months. The countless tiny seeds can also contribute food value and may be ground or incorporated into other preparations. What looks from a distance like a handful of red openings at the tops of giant plants becomes at ground level a major seasonal resource. The harvest also demonstrates why cactus use cannot be understood simply as emergency survival. People do not wait until they are dehydrated and then search randomly for a saguaro. The fruiting season is anticipated. Families know when the fruits are likely to mature and where productive stands are located. Harvest camps may be established near concentrations of plants. Tools are prepared before the fruit is fully ripe. Labor is organized around the narrow window when the crop is abundant enough to justify intensive gathering. The desert, in other words, is treated as a calendar rather than as a crisis. That calendar is linked closely to weather. Saguaro flowering and fruit development reflect rainfall, temperature, and other environmental conditions from earlier in the year. A strong harvest can follow favorable conditions, while prolonged drought may reduce productivity. Fruit ripening occurs near the beginning of the summer rainy season in parts of the Sonoran Desert, creating an important seasonal relationship between plant abundance and the anticipated arrival of storms. Traditional ecological knowledge connects these events in ways that are practical as well as cultural. The cactus does not merely produce food. Its flowering and fruiting become part of how people read the changing year. For some indigenous communities, the saguaro harvest carries ceremonial importance that goes far beyond nutrition. The fruit and its preparations can be incorporated into gatherings connected with rain renewal and the turning of the season. Fermented beverages made from cactus fruit have historically played roles in specific ceremonies. These practices differ among communities and should not be treated as a single universal tradition, but they reveal an important point. A plant that contributes to physical survival can also become embedded in systems of meaning. When a resource appears reliably at one of the most difficult times of year, it is not surprising that people come to understand its arrival as part of a larger relationship between human life and the desert. Archaeology has difficulty reconstructing the full antiquity of these ceremonial traditions. Fermented liquids leave little direct evidence. Wooden harvesting poles decay, and temporary camps may preserve only scattered traces. Scholars still debate how particular historic practices relate to much older patterns of cactus use. Yet the ecological logic behind intensive saguaro harvesting is strong. The fruit appears predictably can be gathered in large quantities, contains both moisture and energy, and can be processed for storage. Even without reconstructing every ritual detail, it is clear why generations of desert communities would return to it. The saguaro itself makes this relationship even more remarkable because it is a slow-growing plant. A young saguaro may spend years as a small vulnerable column protected beneath a nursery or shrub. It can take decades before reaching substantial height, and even longer before developing the branching arms that make mature individuals so visually distinctive. Some survive for well over a century. A productive grove therefore represents more than this year's rainfall. It is a long-lived structure in the landscape connecting human generations to plants that may have been standing before their grandparents were born. This longevity encourages a different kind of attention. A saguaro cannot be replaced quickly if destroyed. Harvesting fruit without damaging the stem allows the same plant to continue producing across many seasons. Birds and mammals carry away seeds, helping new generations of cactus establish where conditions allow. Humans participate in this cycle, rather than standing outside it. What survives in the record suggests that indigenous desert economies often depend on understanding these long-term relationships, though the evidence can rarely reveal every rule or custom that guided harvesting. There is also a practical lesson hidden in the height of the fruit. The useful moisture is not in the giant trunk as an easy drink. It is concentrated in a reproductive structure produced seasonally and meant to be eaten. The safest and most productive strategy therefore requires patience. Instead of cutting open the plant and destroying years of growth, for uncertain liquid people, wait for the moment when the cactus offers food openly. The fruit is harvested, the plant remains standing, and the same source may feed people again the following year. During the weeks of ripening, the Sonoran Desert briefly changes character. Dark fruits open against green columns. Birds call from cactus crowns. Seeds scatter into the dust. People move among familiar stands carrying long harvesting poles, gathering a crop that appears precisely when the landscape seems least generous. The scene captures the deeper logic of desert survival. Scarcity is real, but it is not absolute. Life persists in pulse, and those who understand the timing of those pulses can turn one of the driest seasons into a moment of abundance. A desert traveler who knows only how to recognize cactus has learned very little. The deepest skill is learning what the cactus is saying about the ground around it. Plants do not grow at random. Their size, density, condition, flowering time, and association with other species can reveal patterns of soil drainage, elevation, frost, and rainfall. To people who spend generations moving through the same dry country, these patterns become a kind of unwritten map. A stand of healthy cactus may signal that runoff collects nearby. A line of greener vegetation can betray a buried wash. Certain shrubs may cluster where moisture lingers longer after storms. Birds moving repeatedly toward one canyon near dusk can suggest dependable water or fruiting plants beyond sight. None of these signs guarantees a spring, but together they can narrow uncertainty in a landscape where a wrong decision cost energy and water. This form of navigation depends on observation at several scales. The broadest clues come from terrain. Mountains interrupt moving air and create differences in rainfall from one side of a range to another. Canyons provide shade and sometimes preserve moisture after exposed plains have dried. Alluvial fans spread sediments and channel runoff. Dry riverbeds may appear useless for most of the year, yet they record exactly where water travels when storms arrive. Ancient travelers who know the country recognize that an empty wash is not merely empty. Its vegetation, sediment, and shape reveal the behavior of water over time. Cactus distribution adds another layer. Some species tolerate colder elevations while others remain concentrated in warmer valleys. Certain columnar cacti thrive only within particular combinations of winter temperature and summer rainfall. Prickly pear can spread across a much wider range but may grow especially densely in disturbed or favorable soils. A traveler who understands these associations can estimate what kind of country lies ahead simply from the vegetation changing around a trail. The plants become indicators of climate on a human scale. The condition of individual plants can also matter. A cactus swollen after recent rainfall tells a different story from one deeply contracted by prolonged drought. Heavy flowering may suggest that previous conditions allowed the plant to invest energy in reproduction. Poor flowering across a broad area can warn that the season is less productive than expected. These signs do not function like precise instruments, and scholars still debate how specific environmental cues were interpreted in prehistoric contexts, because such knowledge rarely leaves direct archaeological traces. Yet later, indigenous ecological traditions demonstrate how detailed plant observation can become when livelihoods depend on it. Animals offer moving information. Birds may gather around ripe cactus fruit, becoming visible markers of abundance from a distance. Bats visit flowering and fruiting columnar cacti at night, transporting pollen and seeds across the desert. Coyotes, javelinas, rodents, deer, and other animals consume cactus fruits or tissues when available. Their tracks can reveal where productive patches lie. More importantly, repeated animal movement can sometimes indicate routes towards spring seeps or shaded drainages. Ancient hunters already have reason to study these patterns, so information about food, game, and water overlaps naturally. This does not mean following an animal blindly will lead to water. Desert wildlife survives through strategies very different from human needs, and many species obtain substantial moisture from food without drinking frequently. A bird may be traveling to fruit rather than a spring. A small mammal may never visit open water at all. Experienced observation works because clues are combined rather than trusted individually. Terrain tracks, vegetation, recent weather, and remembered geography all reinforce or contradict one another. The desert becomes readable, not through one secret sign, but through patterns. Storms temporarily rewrite that map. Summer rain can fall violently and locally, producing flowing water in one drainage, while leaving another dry only a short distance away. The smell of wet earth may arrive before the storm itself. Distant thunder can indicate rain falling in mountains invisible from a valley floor. Dark clouds over higher ground may mean that flash floods will later descend through channels under clear skies. This creates both opportunity and danger. Fresh water may collect in rock basins and depressions, but the channels that carry it can become deadly without warning. Knowledge of these temporary sources can greatly extend movement. Natural rock tanks, sometimes called tinayas, in parts of the southwest collect storm runoff in stone basins. Some hold water only briefly. Deeper ones can persist far longer in shaded locations. Springs and seeps provide more dependable supplies, although their flow can vary by season and drought. Ancient communities returning repeatedly to these places may leave archaeological traces nearby, including camps, tools, pottery, or trails. Their importance is obvious: a landscape with cactus food, but no reliable drinking water remains difficult to occupy for long. The routes connecting these sources can become cultural infrastructure. Unlike a paved road, a desert trail may leave only faint physical evidence, but for the people using it, the route is dense with landmarks. A distinctive ridge marks the direction to a spring. A grove of mesquite indicates a drainage. A cluster of saguaros signals familiar harvesting ground. A sheltered rock face offers shade at midday. A seasonal pool lies beyond a particular saddle in the hills. Such information can be memorized, taught, and embedded in stories or customary travel patterns without ever being written down. Cactus matters within this network because it can make the distances between true water sources more manageable. A traveller who reaches ripe, prickly pear fruit along the route gains food containing moisture. Someone moving through a saguaro harvest zone can supplement carried provisions. This may reduce how quickly water stores are depleted, especially if travel occurs during cooler hours. But the direction of dependence remains clear. Cactus supports movement between water sources. It does not remove the need for those sources. A lesser-known aspect of desert navigation is that edible plants can serve as timing devices as much as landmarks. Flowering and fruiting occur within seasonal windows influenced by temperature and rainfall. Knowing that one resource has begun to ripen can signal that another will soon become available at a different elevation or farther north. Human movement can therefore follow not only geography, but phenology, the recurring seasonal timing of biological events. The landscape functions almost like a sequence of openings, with each plant becoming useful for a limited period. What survives in the archaeological record cannot reconstruct every decision made along these routes. A person noticing bird movement leaves no trace. The choice to rest beneath one cliff instead of another disappears completely. Yet long occupation of arid regions would be difficult to explain without such knowledge. Survival depends on reading landscapes at a level of detail invisible to outsiders. To someone unfamiliar with the desert cactus may seem like the most obvious symbol of endurance. To those who know the country, it's only one sign among many. The real map is written across soil slopes, clouds, plants, animals, and memory. Water is rarely where desperation begins looking for it. It is where generations have already learned to expect it. The most misleading way to imagine ancient desert survival is to picture one miraculous plant solving the problem of thirst. Cactus is important precisely because it is not enough on its own. People who live successfully in arid landscapes survive through combinations of resources that overlap in time and space. Springs provide dependable drinking water when they flow. Rock basins hold runoff after storms. Mesquite pods offer carbohydrates that can be dried and stored. Agave supplies dense food after careful roasting. Yucca contributes fibers and edible parts. Seeds, small game, larger animals, insects, roots, cultivated crops in later periods, and seasonal fruits all become part of a network. Cactus fits into this network as a moisture-rich food, a predictable seasonal harvest, and sometimes a useful material, but never as a magical replacement for water. This layered strategy is what makes long-term occupation possible. A single resource can fail. A spring may weaken during prolonged drought. A mesquite crop may be poor. Game may move elsewhere. Frost can damage cactus flowers before they develop into fruit. Summer rain may arrive late or not at all. Communities that depend too heavily on one source become vulnerable to exactly these fluctuations. Those who understand many resources can shift pressure from one to another. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that ancient desert economies are often remarkably flexible, even when researchers cannot reconstruct every food or water source used in a particular season. Agave offers a useful comparison with cactus. Its thick leaves make it look similar in broad terms, but its human use follows a different pattern. The most valuable food is often concentrated in the heart of the plant, which can be roasted for long periods to break down complex carbohydrates into more digestible sugars. This requires fuel planning labor and usually the destruction of the harvested plant. In contrast, prickly pear fruit can be collected repeatedly without killing the cactus. The two resources therefore complement each other. One offers dense cooked calories after intensive preparation. The other can provide fresh moisture and sugar with less processing. Mesquite operates differently again. Its pods can be abundant, nutritious, and highly storable, but they are relatively dry compared with cactus fruit. Ground into meal, they provide energy over long periods, Yet eating dry foods increases the importance of having drinking water nearby. Combining mesquite with moisture-rich plant foods helps balance this problem. Ancient diets are therefore better understood as systems rather than lists of edible species. The value of each food depends partly on what it contributes that other foods do not. Animal foods add another dimension. Hunting supplies protein and fat, but success is uncertain and often costly in energy. Pursuing game through extreme heat can consume water quickly. Small animals may be easier to collect but provide less food. In some environments, hunting becomes more efficient around known water sources, seasonal migrations, or productive plant zones where animals gather. Cactus fruit can indirectly help here as well. When ripe fruit attracts birds, rodents, javelinas, or other animals, it concentrates multiple resources in the same place. A productive cactus stand becomes not only a plant harvest zone but also a point of ecological activity. This interconnectedness is easy to overlook because archaeological discoveries are often discussed one item at a time. A charred seed is identified. A cactus seed appears in a coprolite. Grinding stones indicate plant processing. Animal bones reveal butchery. Pottery fragments suggest storage or cooking. Yet the lived reality is that all of these traces belong to a daily system in which food, water labour season and mobility are inseparable. The evidence remains incomplete, but when these clues are considered together they point towards sophisticated planning rather than desperate improvisation. Storage becomes one of the most important tools in this system. Water can sometimes be stored in pottery or other containers, though transport weight limits how much can be carried over distance. Food storage is often more efficient. Drying fruit, grinding seeds, preserving roasted plant foods, and keeping grains or pods for later allows people to convert short periods of abundance into reserves that support less productive months. Cactus contributes to this process by producing harvests that can be consumed fresh and partially preserved. The fresh portion helps with hydration immediately. The processed portion contributes calories later after the fruiting season has ended. Mobility offers another form of storage, not in containers but in knowledge. Instead of carrying everything needed for months, mobile or semi-mobile groups can move between places where resources become available at different times. A low valley may produce cactus fruit first. Higher terrain may offer later harvests or cooler conditions. A spring that is marginal in one season may become important in another. Movement allows people to follow abundance, rather than waiting in one place for scarcity to end. Even settled agricultural communities can maintain seasonal gathering trips beyond their fields, adding wild foods to cultivated crops. As farming develops in parts of the ancient Americas, this older desert knowledge does not simply disappear. Maize, beans, squash, and other crops increase food production, but agriculture creates its own dependence on rainfall irrigation and stored water. Drought can threaten fields severely. Wild resources, including cactus, remain valuable as buffers when cultivated harvests fail. A family that knows how to gather desert foods possesses another layer of security beyond its fields. No single explanation fully accounts for how different communities balance farming, gathering, hunting, and mobility, and the mix changes greatly across region and time, but resilience consistently comes from diversity. There is also a social dimension to this system. A person may know one spring, but a community can remember many. One household may lose stored food while relatives elsewhere have surplus. Trade moves resources across environmental zones. Marriage and kinship connect groups with access to different landscapes. Information about rainfall harvests or failing water sources can travel along these networks. Survival is therefore not simply biological or technological. It is social. Knowledge shared between people extends the effective size of the landscape from which they can draw support. Cactus becomes most powerful within this larger framework. It contributes moisture when water is precious fruit, when calories are needed, predictable harvests, when other foods are uncertain and materials that can be used in daily life. But its usefulness grows because it is combined with everything else. Springs make cactus harvest camps possible. Cactus fruit makes travel between springs easier. Stored mesquite carries people through periods when cactus is not fruiting. Agave provides dense food when fresh resources are scarce. Hunting adds nutrients unavailable from plants alone. Each piece strengthens the others. The real secret of living in the desert is therefore redundancy. Ancient people do not need one perfect answer to drought. They need many partial answers that overlap. When one weakens, another carries more of the burden. Cactus is memorable because it visibly holds moisture where the landscape appears dry, but the deeper achievement belongs to the people who learn to weave it into a much larger system of survival. Fresh cactus fruit solves only part of the problem because abundance in the desert is often brief. A stand may be heavy with ripe fruit for days or weeks, and then suddenly offer almost nothing. Heat accelerates decay. Insects arrive quickly. Birds and mammals compete for the same crop. Fruit that is soft enough to eat is also soft enough to spoil. Ancient communities therefore face a familiar challenge: how to turn a temporary pulse of moisture and sugar into food that can survive long after the harvest itself has disappeared. The answer is not one technique, but a range of methods that transform cactus from something immediately refreshing into something storable, portable, and useful during leaner seasons. Some fruit is eaten fresh because that is when its water content matters most. A ripe prickly pear or saguaro fruit can help replenish moisture during the harvest itself, reducing pressure on carried supplies. But the portion that cannot be consumed immediately must be changed. Drying is one of the simplest methods. Pulp can be spread thinly in the sun, allowing much of its water to evaporate while concentrating sugars and solids. The result is less useful for immediate hydration, but far more useful for storage. A food that would spoil quickly can now survive much longer and weigh less when transported. This trade-off between moisture and durability lies at the heart of desert food preservation. Fresh food is heavy and perishable, but helps satisfy thirst. Dried food is light and durable, but requires water later when eaten. Ancient communities balance these advantages according to season and movement. During harvest, fresh cactus may form an important part of the daily diet. Later, dried cakes or concentrated pulp become reserve foods, carried between camps or stored near settlements. The cactus has shifted roles without ceasing to be valuable. Boiling offers another way to preserve abundance. Cactus pulp or juice can be heated slowly until part of the water evaporates and the natural sugars become concentrated. The result may be a thick syrup or paste that stores more effectively than raw fruit. This process requires fuel vessels, time and labor, so it is not cost-free. In treeless or sparsely wooded country, firewood itself can be a limited resource. The decision to boil large quantities therefore reflects planning. The energy spent on preservation must be justified by the value of the food saved. In areas where pottery is available, cooking and storage become easier to organize. Before widespread ceramic use, other containers and heating techniques are possible, including baskets treated for particular purposes, stone heating or processing in pits, though the details vary greatly by region and period. Scholars still debate the antiquity of some specific cactus processing traditions because soft fruit residues rarely preserve clearly. What survives in the record suggests that ancient peoples routinely invested labor in extending the life of seasonal plant foods, even when archaeology cannot always identify the exact recipe. Seeds add another level of storage potential. Many cactus fruits contain large numbers of hard seeds that pass easily through fresh pulp. These can be eaten along with the fruit, separated, dried, or sometimes ground. Their small size makes them easy to overlook, yet collectively they represent concentrated nutrition. Archaeological seeds found in dry caves, coprolites, and occupation layers provide some of the strongest direct evidence for cactus consumption, because they survive when the surrounding flesh is gone. A scattered cluster of tiny seeds can preserve the trace of a meal thousands of years after its moisture has vanished completely. Fermentation introduces a different transformation. Sugary cactus juices can begin fermenting naturally under the right conditions, and some indigenous traditions develop controlled or semi-controlled fermented beverages associated with social and ceremonial life. Fermentation does not simply preserve calories, it alters taste chemistry and meaning. A resource gathered for survival can become part of ritual seasonal gatherings and collective identity. The archaeological evidence for the earliest fermented cactus beverages is difficult to establish, and later documented traditions should not automatically be projected unchanged into deep prehistory. Even so, the possibility illustrates how food preservation can become cultural practice. Storage also changes the rhythm of settlement. A community that can preserve cactus harvest is less tightly bound to the exact moment of ripening. Surplus can be carried away from the grove, exchanged with neighboring groups, or consumed during periods when fresh food is scarce. This creates flexibility. A productive cactus zone no longer matters only while fruit hangs on the plant. Its value can extend months beyond the harvest through stored products. Transport magnifies this advantage. Water is heavy. A litre weighs about a kilogram, and moving large quantities across rugged desert terrain requires considerable effort. Dried or concentrated food provides energy without the same transport burden. This does not eliminate the need to carry water, but it allows travellers to reduce the amount of bulky fresh food they must move. If a route passes dependable springs or seasonal water points, concentrated cactus products can support longer journeys between them. Trade may carry these foods farther still. Archaeological evidence across the ancient Southwest and Mesoamerica shows that people exchange materials over impressive distances, including stone shells, pigments, ceramics, and food products. Perishable cactus preparations are harder to track directly because they rarely survive in recognizable form. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is reasonable to infer that durable plant foods could move through the same social networks that carried other goods, especially between ecological zones with different seasonal resources. The act of preserving fruit also concentrates labor and knowledge. Harvesters must recognize the right stage of ripeness. Processors must remove spines, separate damaged fruit, manage fire, judge consistency, and decide when a product is dry or concentrated enough to store. Mistakes can lead to spoilage and wasted effort. These tasks are learned skills, not automatic outcomes of having access to cactus. A lesser-known consequence of processing is that it transforms the relationship between people and time. Fresh fruit ties survival to the present moment. Stored fruit creates a bridge into the future. A harvest gathered under summer heat can still feed people after temperatures fall, and the cactus stands a bare. The plant's brief abundance is stretched across the calendar through human labor. That may be one of the clearest examples of how ancient desert communities survive scarcity. They do not simply consume what the environment offers when it appears. They change it. They dry it, grind it, boil it, store it, carry it, and fold it into social systems that extend its usefulness far beyond the original harvest. Cactus begins as moisture held inside living tissue, but through human knowledge, it becomes something more enduring, a reserve of calories, memory, and time. Once cactus becomes part of everyday survival, its value begins to spread far beyond food and moisture. A plant that can endure drought, defend itself, grow in poor soil, and regenerate after careful cutting, naturally becomes useful in other ways. Ancient communities do not see the desert divided into neat categories of edible plants, medicinal plants, building materials, and ritual objects. A single species can cross several of those boundaries. Cactus can feed a family during one season, supply fiber, or tools during another, help protect a settlement, treat certain ailments, provide pigments, and eventually acquire symbolic meanings connected with fertility, endurance, blood rain, death, and renewal. Its usefulness grows because people learn to recognize not just what is inside the plant, but what its structure can do. Spines are among the simplest examples. What protects the cactus can become useful to humans once removed from the plant. Large, stiff spines can serve as piercing implements for delicate tasks. They may function as needles picks or small awls when the material is suitable, sometimes combined with plant fibers to create simple sewing tools. Not every spine is strong enough for every purpose, and archaeological evidence for such objects can be difficult to interpret because organic attachments disappear, but the basic logic is obvious. In landscapes where bone, stone, shell, and wood are all valuable materials, cactus spines add another option that requires little shaping before use. The pads and fibrous tissues can also serve practical roles. In some regions, dried cactus material becomes fuel when better firewood is limited, though it burns differently from dense wood and cannot replace it in every task. Large cactus ribs, particularly from columnar species after the plant has died naturally, can be collected as lightweight structural material. The woody internal ribs of saguaros and other tall cacti can be used in tools, roofing frameworks, fencing, or other small constructions, where their length and relative straightness are useful. A cactus that has spent decades storing water can therefore leave behind a skeleton that remains useful long after the living tissue has disappeared. Living cactus can be even more valuable than dead material. Dense stands of prickly pear and other spiny species form natural barriers. Encouraged around gardens, paths, animal enclosures, or settlement edges, they can discourage both animals and people from crossing casually. Unlike a wooden fence, a living cactus boundary does not need to be rebuilt after every season. It can expand root from fallen pads and become stronger over time. It may also produce edible fruit while serving as protection. Scholars still debate the age and extent of deliberate living fences in different regions, but the practice fits naturally within wider traditions of plant management. Once people begin transplanting useful cactus closer to places where they live, the line between wild resource and constructed landscape becomes increasingly blurred. Cactus also enters medicine, though here caution is especially important. Indigenous communities across the Americas develop medicinal uses for particular cactus species and preparations, but these traditions are highly specific and should not be reduced to the claim that cactus generally cures illness. Pads, fruits, sap roots, or other tissues may be used externally or internally for different purposes, depending on species and culture. Some preparations are applied to wound swelling or skin irritation. Others are incorporated into treatments for digestive problems or other conditions. Modern research has investigated certain biochemical properties of edible cacti, but it does not validate every traditional claim in the same way, and ancient practices cannot always be reconstructed directly from archaeology. What survives in the record suggests a broad experimentation with desert plants, while the exact boundaries between food medicine and ritual often remain difficult to separate. Pigments reveal another unexpected connection. The most famous red dye associated with cactus does not actually come from the cactus itself, but from insects living on it. Cochineal insects feed on certain prickly pear cacti and produce carminic acid as a defense. When collected and processed, they create an intense red pigment. The large-scale historical importance of cochineal becomes especially clear in later Mesoamerican societies and after European contact in global trade. Its precise development belongs to periods much later than the earliest cactus gathering. Yet the relationship demonstrates how deeply human communities eventually learn to exploit entire ecological partnerships surrounding these plants. The cactus supports the insect provides pigment, and human knowledge transforms both into one of the most valuable colorants of the early modern world. Animals also benefit from cactus, sometimes creating another form of stored water. In dry seasons, edible pads can provide livestock with moisture as well as food when prepared correctly, particularly in later pastoral economies. Some species require burning or scraping to remove spines before animals can consume them safely. This use becomes especially significant after domesticated livestock are introduced into many parts of the Americas, so it should not be projected unchanged into prehistoric life. Yet long before sheep or cattle arrive, wild animals are already feeding on cactus fruits and tissues, tying the plants to hunting opportunities and wider ecological cycles. The symbolic life of cactus may be even harder to trace than its practical uses. Ritual meaning rarely preserves as clearly as seeds or tools. A cactus depicted in art placed in a ceremonial setting or associated with a particular place can carry meanings that modern researchers only partially understand. Some cactus species become connected with sacred landscapes, seasonal ceremonies, fertility rain ancestry, or altered states of consciousness. These traditions differ greatly from one community to another. No single explanation fully accounts for why cactus acquires such powerful symbolism, but its biology offers an obvious foundation. A plant that remains green when everything around it has withered naturally invites associations with persistence and renewal. Its flowers strengthen that impression. Many cacti spend much of the year appearing defensive and austere, then suddenly produce large, vivid blossoms. Some open for only a brief period. Others depend on bats, moths, bees, birds, or other pollinators that arrive at precise times. Fruit follows often during seasons when heat and dryness are intense. To people whose survival depends on recognizing those cycles, flowering is not merely beautiful. It signals change. It marks the movement of the year and the approach of food. Even waste can become part of the system. Discarded pads may root where they fall. Seeds pass through animals or are thrown near camps and may germinate under favorable conditions. Processing areas accumulate organic material that changes soils slightly over time. People intending only to eat cactus can therefore influence where cactus grows. Repeated occupation can create small feedback loops in which useful plants become more common near human activity. The cactus thus moves from emergency resource to infrastructure. It can mark boundaries, supply tools, contribute medicine support, animals produce color indirectly, provide building material and anchor ritual meaning. What began as a way to survive dry country becomes woven into the practical and symbolic fabric of life. The more closely people understand the plant, the less it resembles a desperate substitute for water, and the more it becomes something larger, a durable companion in the shaping of desert society. As settlements become more permanent and agriculture expands across parts of ancient Mesoamerica, cactus begins to occupy a new position in human life. It is no longer only something gathered from the surrounding landscape when the season is right. In some regions, useful plants are increasingly protected, transplanted, encouraged, and eventually cultivated close to where people live. This transition does not happen everywhere in the same way, and it is rarely possible to draw a sharp line between wild gathering and agriculture. Instead, the relationship changes gradually. A productive prickly pear growing near a path may be spared when surrounding vegetation is cleared. Pads from a desirable plant may be moved closer to a settlement. Seeds from large or sweet fruits may be discarded in places where new plants can establish. Over generations, these small choices begin to reshape the desert itself. Prickly pear is especially suited to this kind of management because it can reproduce vegetatively. A detached pad that lands on suitable soil can form roots and become a new plant. This makes transplantation far easier than with species that depend entirely on carefully collected seeds. People do not need sophisticated horticultural technology to expand a useful stand. A healthy pad can be cut, carried, placed in the ground, and allowed to root. In an environment where rainfall is unreliable, this is a remarkable advantage. The new plant still requires favorable conditions, but once established, it can survive drought that would severely damage many annual crops. This quality makes cactus a useful companion to agriculture rather than a competitor with it. Maize beans, squash, and other cultivated plants can produce far more concentrated food, but they're also vulnerable to failed rains, pests, frost, and timing mistakes. Prickly pear grows on marginal land that may be poorly suited to grain cultivation. It can occupy rocky slopes, field edges, settlement margins, and boundaries where other crops perform badly. The result is a layered food system. Fields provide staple calories when conditions are good. Cactus adds moisture-rich fruit and edible pads, while demanding comparatively little water once established. The relationship becomes particularly important in central Mexico, where prickly pear eventually plays a major role in both subsistence and settlement landscapes. Different forms are valued for different qualities. Some produce larger fruits, others have better flavor, fewer spines, more tender pads, or more predictable yields. Human preference begins to influence which plants are propagated. Over long periods, repeated selection can create noticeable differences between managed varieties and their wild relatives. The exact chronology of these processes remains debated because plant domestication is rarely visible in a single archaeological moment, but what survives in the record suggests a long continuum from gathering to deliberate cultivation. This is one of the more surprising ways ancient people respond to drought. Instead of trying to force every part of the landscape into conventional agriculture, they maintain plants already adapted to dryness. A cactus does not require irrigation in the same way a thirsty crop does. Its shallow roots capture brief rainfall, its tissues store moisture, and its CAM metabolism reduces water loss. By moving useful cacti closer to settlements, people effectively bring a drought-resistant food reserve into their daily environment. The plant is still dependent on rain, but its biology makes it far more forgiving of dry intervals than many cultivated staples. Living cactus fences may become part of this managed landscape as well. Rows of prickly pear can mark property, protect gardens, slow animals, and produce food at the same time. A boundary that bears fruit is more than a fence. It is infrastructure that grows. Pads can be replaced where gaps appear. Old plants can be renewed from cuttings. The barrier thickens over time rather than decaying like wood. Such systems are well documented in later periods, though scholars still debate how early particular forms of cactus fencing and deliberate field edge planting began. The broader principle, however, is consistent with ancient strategies of increasing useful plant density around places of repeated human activity. Management also changes access to moisture. A wild cactus grove may lie several kilometers from a settlement, requiring a harvesting trip during the hottest part of the year. A cultivated or transplanted stand near homes reduces that distance. Fresh fruit can be eaten with less travel. Pads can be collected when needed. Children, older adults, and others who may not join long-gathering expeditions can still participate in processing and consumption. Bringing cactus into the settlement landscape therefore changes not just production but labor. It also affects food security. During a good agricultural year, cactus may supplement other foods and provide seasonal variety. During a poor year, its value rises. A drought severe enough to reduce maize yields may not eliminate cactus fruit entirely, especially if different varieties and locations respond differently. No plant is immune to prolonged environmental stress, and severe drought can reduce cactus productivity as well, but diversity again becomes the key. A community surrounded by several kinds of cultivated and wild resources is less vulnerable than one dependent on a single harvest. Over time, people may also become more selective about fruit quality. A sweeter fruit is preferred for eating. A larger fruit provides more pulp for the same harvesting effort. A less spiny plant is easier to handle. A pad with good texture is more useful as food. When these plants are propagated repeatedly, human preferences begin to leave biological traces. Domestication is therefore not always a dramatic event. It can be the cumulative result of countless ordinary decisions made by people who simply keep replanting the cactus they like best. The archaeological challenge is proving exactly when these decisions become systematic. Cactus seeds can show consumption, but they do not necessarily reveal whether the fruit came from a wild or cultivated plant. Pollen can indicate presence but not always management. Changes in fruit size or seed morphology may offer clues, yet preservation is inconsistent. Settlement patterns, botanical remains, and later historical evidence must often be combined. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the development of cactus cultivation across such a large and culturally diverse region. What is clear is that cactus eventually becomes deeply integrated into settled life. It stands beside homes along field boundaries, near paths and in cultivated plots. It provides fruit in one season and pads in another. It asks relatively little from water stores while offering something during years when other plants struggle. In this way, ancient farmers are not simply imposing agriculture onto a hostile desert. They are borrowing the desert's own strategies. The transformation is subtle but profound. Generations earlier, cactus may have been a resource encountered along a seasonal route. Now it can be deliberately placed where people need it. The landscape is no longer only read, it is edited. And in those carefully managed stands of prickly pear, the old knowledge of drought survival begins to merge with something new. Agriculture designed not to conquer scarcity but to live with it. For all the importance cactus may have held in ancient desert life, proving exactly how people used it is surprisingly difficult. The plant is built to survive harsh conditions while alive, but once harvested its soft tissues decay quickly. Fruit pulp disappears, pads rot, juice leaves almost nothing behind. Wooden tools break down. Temporary harvesting camps can vanish beneath wind-blown sediment or later occupation. This creates a strange imbalance in the archaeological record. Stone tools, pottery bones, and architecture may survive for thousands of years, while some of the foods that sustain daily life leave only faint traces. Reconstructing ancient cactus use therefore requires archaeologists to work with small clues, indirect evidence, and unusual forms of preservation. Seeds are among the most important traces because they are tougher than the flesh surrounding them. Cactus fruits can contain dozens or even hundreds of seeds, and many pass through the digestive system intact. In dry caves and rock shelters where organic material sometimes survives exceptionally well, archaeologists have recovered seeds associated with ancient occupation deposits. A concentration of cactus seeds in a hearth area storage context or human coprolite can provide strong evidence that the plant was eaten. Yet even then the interpretation has limits. Seeds can show consumption, but they rarely reveal the complete preparation method. The same remains might come from fresh fruit dried pulp boiled preparations or a mixture of several foods eaten together. Coprolites are particularly revealing because they preserve direct evidence of what individuals consumed. In very dry environments, ancient human feces can desiccate before decomposition destroys them. When analyzed carefully, they may contain seeds, plant fibers, pollen, microscopic fragments, and other dietary remains. A single specimen can preserve a compressed record of meals eaten thousands of years ago. Cactus seeds found within such material are difficult to dismiss as accidental contamination. They demonstrate that the fruit entered the human digestive system. But even these remarkable remains represent only short moments in individual lives. One meal cannot define an entire seasonal economy. Pollen offers another source of information, though it must be interpreted cautiously. Cactus pollen can appear in archaeological sediments on tools or occasionally in material associated with food preparation. Its presence may indicate that flowering plants grew nearby, or that flowers and fruits were being handled. Yet pollen travels. Wind insects, animals, and contaminated sediments can move microscopic grains away from their original source. Researchers therefore look for patterns rather than relying on isolated finds. When botanical remains, pollen artifacts, and settlement location all point in the same direction, the case for deliberate plant use becomes much stronger. Plant fibers can survive under similarly favorable conditions. Fragments of cactus tissue, dried peels, cordage mats, sandals, baskets, and other organic materials occasionally endure in protected caves or extremely arid deposits. Such discoveries are valuable because they reveal uses that seeds alone cannot show. A fibrous fragment may indicate food processing, construction, or manufacture. A woven object found beside cactus remains can suggest how harvesting or transport occurred. Still, identifying deteriorated fibers to a precise species can be difficult, and the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeologists must avoid turning every ambiguous plant fragment into proof of a particular practice simply because that interpretation is appealing. Grinding stones add a different kind of clue. These tools are often associated with processing seeds, pods, grains, and other plant foods. If cactus seeds or residues occur near them, researchers may infer that cactus products were being crushed or ground. Microscopic wear patterns and chemical residues can sometimes strengthen such interpretations. But grinding tools are multi-purpose objects. The same stone may be used for mesquite maize, wild seeds, pigments, and cactus at different times. Without residues or securely associated plant remains, the tool itself cannot prove what was processed on it. Cooking features create similar uncertainty. Hearths, roasting pits, and boiling installations reveal that food processing took place, but they rarely preserve a complete menu. Charred cactus tissues are less common than harder seeds or woody plant material. If cactus was eaten raw or lightly processed, there may be no fire-related trace at all. This means archaeology can easily underestimate foods that require little cooking. The plants most visible in the archaeological record are not necessarily the plants most important in life. Settlement patterns can help fill these gaps. Sites located near dependable springs, washes, productive cactus zones, or seasonal harvesting areas may indicate that access to plant and water resources influenced where people camped or built. Repeated occupation of the same location across centuries suggests that certain places offered reliable advantages. Yet ancient landscapes are not identical to modern ones. Climate shifts, erosion, grazing agriculture, urban development, and invasive species can change where cactus grows today. Researchers must reconstruct past environments, rather than simply looking at the vegetation currently surrounding an archaeological site. This is where paleoenvironmental evidence becomes essential. Pollen cores, pack rat middens, charcoal sediments, and other natural archives can reveal how vegetation changed through time. Pack rat middens are especially useful in the arid southwest. These rodents collect plant fragments and other materials near their nests, which can become preserved in hardened deposits for thousands of years. By identifying ancient plant remains within them, scientists can reconstruct where particular species once grew and how vegetation shifted as climate changed. A cactus found far outside its modern range may reveal that ancient people encountered very different plant communities from those visible today. Ethnographic and historical records provide another layer, but they must be handled with care. Indigenous communities documented in recent centuries often possess detailed knowledge of cactus, harvesting, processing, storage, medicine, and ceremony. These traditions can help archaeologists recognize possibilities that artifacts alone would never reveal. A strange wooden implement may make more sense when compared with documented harvesting tools. A concentration of seeds may become easier to interpret when researchers understand how fruits are traditionally processed. Yet scholars still debate how directly such practices can be projected into the distant past. Cultures change, populations move, technologies spread, and colonial disruption transforms older lifeways. The strongest reconstructions therefore combine multiple lines of evidence. Seeds show consumption, coprolites reveal direct dietary intake, fibers hint at processing, grinding tools suggest preparation, settlement locations show repeated access, environmental records establish which plants were available. Later traditions demonstrate how complex cactus use can become. None of these clues is perfect by itself, but together they create a pattern. What archaeology can prove is narrower than the full lived experience. It can show that cactus was eaten, processed, transported, and in some places increasingly managed. It can reveal that desert communities were not merely surviving between accidental discoveries. They were organizing themselves around predictable resources. What it cannot fully recover are the gestures, the exact way a fruit was twisted free, the warning given to a child about glockids, the root remembered after a dry year, the taste of the first ripe fruit after months of scarcity. Those details largely disappear. Yet the surviving fragments are enough to show that cactus was never just scenery. Beneath the modern image of an empty desert lies an archaeological record filled with tiny seeds, worn stones, dried fibers, ancient waste and settlement choices. Together they preserve the outline of a much richer truth. People were learning the desert, with extraordinary precision even when most of that knowledge left almost no durable trace. The most important desert technology may never have been a tool at all. It was memory. A cactus fruit can be eaten in minutes. A wooden harvesting pole can decay within decades. And even a spring can shift or disappear, but knowledge can persist for generations if a community continues to use it, teach it, and attach it to place. The survival value of cactus depends on exactly this kind of transmission. It is not enough to know that a certain plant is edible. Someone must know when it ripens how to approach it, how to remove its defenses, which parts are useful, which preparations are safe, how much can be harvested without damaging the stand, and what other resources appear nearby at the same time. None of these lessons exists in isolation. Together they form an inherited map of the desert. Children growing up in cactus country do not need to learn the landscape as outsiders. Their education begins through repeated movement. They accompany adults on gathering trips. They see which fruits are ignored and which are collected. They learn where the reliable patches lie, where the ground becomes dangerous after rain, and which plants indicate that a wash has held moisture recently. The knowledge is physical as much as verbal. Hands learn how to handle harvesting tools. Feet learn where to step among spines and loose stones. The body learns when the heat is becoming dangerous. Experience accumulates until what once required deliberate attention becomes almost instinctive. This form of teaching is difficult for archaeology to detect. A stone tool can survive. A lesson cannot. Researchers may recover cactus seeds from a cave and know that people ate the fruit, but they cannot see the years of instruction behind that meal. They cannot easily determine who taught whom, how harvesting territories were remembered, or how knowledge was adjusted after unusual droughts. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the very continuity of desert occupation suggests that information had to be transferred effectively. One generation discovering a useful plant would mean little if the next had to begin again from ignorance. Seasonal traditions provide a powerful way to preserve that information. When a harvest occurs at roughly the same point each year, practical knowledge becomes linked to the annual rhythm of community life. People remember the sequence of flowering, fruiting, rainfall, and movement. Certain places become associated with particular times. Harvest camps are revisited, tools are repaired or remade, food processing practices return with the season. In this way, ecology and culture reinforce each other. The calendar is not simply a count of days, it is a chain of expected biological events. Ceremony can strengthen this chain even further. When a useful plant becomes connected with communal gatherings, stories, songs, ritual observances, or obligations, the ecological event becomes harder to forget. The saguaro harvest in the Sonoran Desert offers an especially clear example of how seasonal food gathering can be woven into cultural meaning. The precise antiquity and form of particular ceremonies are not always archaeologically recoverable, and scholars still debate how much continuity can be established across very long periods. But the broader mechanism is easy to understand. A harvest that helps sustain a community physically can also help organize it socially. Memory also preserves failure. Knowledge of abundance is valuable, but memories of drought may be even more important. Elders can remember when a spring ran low, when fruiting failed in one valley but succeeded in another, or when people had to travel farther than usual. Such events influence future decisions. A resource once considered dependable may be treated more cautiously after a severe dry period. Alternative routes may be maintained. Storage may increase. More distant kinship ties may become especially valuable. In this sense, communities do not merely inherit successful techniques, they inherit warnings. The social scale of this information can extend beyond a single settlement. Marriage exchange, pilgrimage, seasonal travel, and kinship networks connect people living in different ecological zones. News about rainfall, harvest conditions, or failing water sources can move along these relationships. A valley suffering drought may still be connected to relatives in a better watered region. Trade can carry preserved food in one direction and other materials in return. Knowledge therefore behaves like a resource, capable of moving across the landscape even when the cactus itself cannot. Colonial expansion transforms many of these systems dramatically. From the 16th century onward, indigenous community across Mexico and the Southwest faced population loss, forced relocation, missionization, warfare, livestock, grazing land seizure, new diseases, and economic change. Traditional access to harvesting grounds can be restricted or broken. Springs are diverted. Agricultural systems are altered. Introduced animals damage vegetation or compete for resources. Settlements move sometimes voluntarily and often under pressure. The landscape that once supported tightly integrated seasonal routines becomes fragmented by new political boundaries and property regimes, yet disruption does not mean disappearance. Indigenous ecological knowledge survives in many communities through continued practice, oral tradition, food preparation, plant management, ceremony, and language. Cactus remains gathered, cultivated, cooked, preserved, and valued. Prickly pear continues to be eaten widely. Saguaro harvesting traditions persist among communities of the Sonoran Desert. Knowledge of local plants continues to pass between generations, even as the surrounding world changes radically. What survives is not a frozen relic of prehistory. It is living knowledge adapting to new circumstances. That distinction matters. Modern observers sometimes treat indigenous plant use as though it were a museum reconstruction of ancient life, but living traditions continue to change just as they always have. New tools may replace old ones. Harvesting schedules may shift with land access or climate. Recipes adapt. Commercial markets alter demand. Conservation concerns affect gathering practices. Continuity lies not in doing everything exactly as ancestors did, but in maintaining relationships with plants and places while responding to new conditions. Climate change adds another challenge. Rising temperatures, prolonged drought, shifting rainfall patterns, wildfire, invasive species, and altered pollinator behavior can affect cactus populations and the species that depend on them. A harvest calendar built through generations may become less predictable. Plants can flower earlier fruit differently, or suffer higher mortality during extreme heat and drought. The same ecological knowledge that once depended on long-term stability must now adapt to increasingly rapid change. This makes traditional knowledge especially important because it contains observations accumulated across timescales far longer than most modern monitoring programs. It can reveal where productive stands once existed, how harvests varied, which plants recovered after drought, and how communities responded when familiar patterns changed. Scientific research and indigenous knowledge are not interchangeable, but when approached respectfully, they can illuminate different parts of the same landscape. The cactus therefore carries more than stored moisture. It carries memory. Every surviving harvesting practice links biology with history. Every productive stand known by name or location reflects generations of attention. Every technique for avoiding spines, preparing fruit, conserving plants, and reading the season represents knowledge tested against real scarcity. Ancient people survived the desert not because they discover one perfect trick, but because they refuse to let useful knowledge disappear. They inherit it, revise it, and pass it onward. Long after individual harvests are forgotten, that continuity becomes the most durable survival reserve of all. By the time the desert has been read across generations, the cactus no longer appears to be a strange reservoir standing alone in empty country. It becomes part of a much larger system of survival, one built from timing, restraint memory, and precise knowledge of limits. The central lesson is almost the opposite of the popular story. Ancient people do not endure water scarcity because they discover how to replace water with cactus. They endure because they learn how to need less at the wrong moment, how to obtain moisture from food when possible, how to move between dependable sources, how to preserve seasonal abundance, and how to recognize danger before thirst becomes an emergency. Cactus contributes to every one of these strategies, but it never performs them alone. A traveler who reaches ripe prickly pear has gained more than food. The fruit provides moisture that slows depletion of carried water. A family harvesting saguaro fruit receives energy during one of the hottest parts of the year. A settlement surrounded by managed cactus has access to a drought-resistant resource close to home. A preserved cactus product extends summer abundance into another season. None of these acts eliminates the need for spring-stored rain wells or flowing water where they're available. Instead, they reduce vulnerability. In an environment where survival can depend on small advantages accumulated over days, reducing vulnerability may be more valuable than finding any single dramatic solution. This is why the phrase surviving without water can be misleading if taken literally. Human beings cannot live indefinitely without drinking water. Even moisture-rich plants cannot overcome the physiological demands of severe heat forever. Ancient desert peoples are not exempt from dehydration, and drought has repeatedly caused migration, hunger, conflict settlement, abandonment, and death. Archaeological evidence from arid regions records periods when communities reorganize or move as climate conditions change. No amount of cactus knowledge makes a failed water system harmless. What knowledge can do is widen the margin between ordinary hardship and catastrophe. That margin is created by hundreds of decisions too small to become famous. Travel begins before the worst heat. Shade is used whenever possible. Heavy labor is timed carefully. Water sources are remembered across large territories. Fresh cactus fruit is eaten while it is available. Dry foods are balanced with moisture-bearing foods. Surplus is preserved. Productive plants are protected. Roots connect springs with harvesting areas. Social relationships provide alternatives when one locality suffers. What survives in the record suggests that successful desert occupation depends on exactly this kind of accumulated flexibility. There is a deeper contradiction in the cactus itself that mirrors this human strategy. The plant is full of water, yet it rarely gives that water away directly. It guards its moisture behind wax spines, acids, fibers, and specialized tissues. Its survival comes from restraint. It opens its stomata at night. It spreads shallow roots to capture brief rain. It expands when water is plentiful and contracts when it is not. It invests in flowers as fruit only when conditions allow. The cactus survives not by possessing unlimited resources, but by managing limited ones with extraordinary efficiency. Ancient desert communities solve the same problem culturally. Their storage vessels, harvesting schedules, trails, food processing methods, and ecological traditions perform functions that resemble the adaptations of the plants around them. Water is captured when available. Food is stored when abundant. Energy expenditure is reduced during dangerous heat. Resources are distributed across time instead of consumed immediately. Knowledge prevents waste. The similarity is not evidence that people consciously imitate cactus biology, but it reveals how the same environment can shape very different forms of adaptation towards similar principles. The surprising result is that some landscapes outsiders call barren are actually highly organized human environments. A patch of prickly pear near a settlement may be partly the result of generations of transplantation. A path between hills may connect old water points. A grove that appears wild may have been harvested repeatedly for centuries. An abandoned grinding stone can mark a processing place beside plants whose descendants still grow nearby. The desert is not simply a wilderness through which humans struggle. In many regions, it is a cultural landscape altered slowly through movement, harvesting, burning, cultivation, and memory. Even the apparent emptiness between settlements can be deceptive. Distance does not mean absence of knowledge. A stretch of dry country may contain named hills, remembered springs, temporary camps, sacred places, seasonal foods, hunting grounds, and trails invisible to anyone unfamiliar with them. Modern maps often emphasize permanent water and built infrastructure. Ancient mental maps can emphasize something more flexible, where water appears after rain, where fruit ripens first, where shade lasts longest, where a canyon traps cool air where animals gather, and where another community may offer support. Scholars still debate many details of how early these systems developed and how intensively particular cactus species were managed in prehistoric periods. Soft plant tissues rarely survive. Oral knowledge leaves almost no direct archaeological trace, and historic traditions cannot simply be projected unchanged into the distant past. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for thousands of years of human success in arid environments, unless sophisticated ecological knowledge is placed near the center of the story. The surviving seeds, coprolites tools, settlement patterns, plant distributions, and living indigenous traditions all point toward relationships far richer than accidental gathering. Cactus becomes one of the clearest symbols of those relationships because it transforms scarcity into something usable. It turns scattered rainfall into stored tissue. Humans then transform that tissue again into fresh food, preserved food, tools, boundaries, cultivated stands, seasonal gatherings, and cultural memory. Water passes from storm to soil, from soil to root, from root to cactus, and finally into human bodies through fruit and edible tissues. At each stage, the resource is conserved, redirected, or stored. The ancient achievement, then, is not surviving entirely without water. It is learning how to survive when water cannot be taken for granted. That distinction contains the real story. The desert does not offer generosity on demand. It offers brief openings. Rain falls somewhere beyond the ridge. A rock basin fills. Fruit ripens for a few weeks. A spring survives another dry season. People who recognize these openings connect them into a way of life, and cactus standing quietly through months of heat becomes one of the most reliable pieces in that connection. Not a miracle canteen, not an unlimited reservoir. Something more useful than either a plant whose biology turns patience into survival, and whose relationship with humans reveals how deeply knowledge can transform an apparently hostile world. Word count 1096. The desert grows quieter when the harvest ends. Fruits disappear from the cactus crowns. The bright pulp that once drew birds, insects, animals, and people is gone, and the plants return to their patient work of holding what moisture remains. Their green stems stand beneath an enormous sky, storing the memory of storms that may have lasted only minutes. Human traces fade in much the same way. A gathering camp disappears beneath dust. A basket decays. A wooden harvesting pole returns to the soil. Footprints vanish after the next rain. Even a trail followed for generations can become almost invisible once people stop walking it. What remains may be only a few seeds inside a dry cave, a worn stone near an ancient hearth, or a cactus growing where someone once placed a pad into the earth. Yet absence is not the same as emptiness. For thousands of years, people learn to live in landscapes that refuse easy abundance. They do it without conquering drought and without discovering a secret source that makes water unnecessary. They survive by noticing more. They remember where rain collects. They recognize the season hidden inside a flower. They carry water, carefully eat moisture when the land offers it, preserve food against the months ahead, and leave enough living behind for another harvest. The cactus remains an unusually fitting witness to that history. It survives by never forgetting scarcity. Every feature of its body reflects the possibility that rain may not return soon. Its roots wait near the surface. Its skin closes against the day. Its tissues hold the last storm long after the ground has dried, and beside it human communities develop their own forms of memory. Across centuries landscapes change, settlements rise and vanish, languages shift, and old routes become difficult to see. But in many desert places, cactus still flowers under the same fierce sun. Fruit still ripens after months of dryness. Moisture still gathers inside tissues protected by spines. The ancient lesson remains quietly present there. Survival was never about finding water where none existed. It was about knowing how to recognize every small form in which life had managed to keep it.